I'll throw to my left here in a minute to hear the response to what you've said about the cuts. But just on this question of income management, are you saying your own party should drop its support for income management? You've just heard Shayne say that he supports income management, but obviously targeted.
A last resort.
Yeah, as a last resort. Should it be a last resort? Should it be any resort?
Well, you know, like what Shayne was saying, I know people who have put themselves on it, and we had what we call in the Northern Territory banned drinkers register, where Aboriginal people put themselves on it because they didn't want to be able to go and buy alcohol. And the thing is, you got to question, like, you look at the surroundings here, people would prefer to be going hunting and fishing and doing all that sort of stuff rather than sitting down getting drunk. Like, where is a means to a, you know, to a future going down that road? And with the income management, you know, like, you have a car, but you're demoralised, you're segregated from the rest of the community. But there are certain elements that I think is sure in terms of the severe sort of dysfunction, but there's a lot of people that, you know, feel, okay, I'm not a worthy citizen, and I'm being told how to do things.
I don't want to sort of have the whole discussion dominated by this, but Noel Pearson's community, in fact the Cape York experiment has a different way of dealing with this, where they have an Indigenous council rather than, let's say, white bureaucrats who are making the decision as to when it's necessary to impose income management, and that seems to be more acceptable to the people who are put on it in a way.
Yeah.
What do you think about that notion?
Yeah, yes and no. But if I can also bring up what's happened since the introduction of the basics cards, you get a significant amount of community stores and they aren't being monitored. And they can go and put a price on a loaf of bread for $5 for a frozen bread, and, you know, all this money that's put in on basic cards, and you can only go and purchase stuff at certain places, you know, they're ripping there's an economy there, there's people that are making significant profits because they have to spend money through this means.
Captive market.
It's a captive market, and that's not being monitored.
Tony, can I just make the point? I think there's one element of Twiggy's advice which I think has relevance, and that is to change the basics card to a fundamental debit card, so that it can be controlled, whether or not you agree with income management. Frankly, what we've got is a basics card which actually discriminates. And if you had a debit card which was accepted by the banks for particular purposes and they could use it anywhere, there wouldn't be an issue. So from that aspect, I think there is some plausibility in what he's talked about. Can I also say, though, that there's no point reinventing the wheel. Over the last 18 months, I was part of a process to develop an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health plan. Now, this health plan was developed by Aboriginal people around the country, sitting down with their leaders in the health sector, sitting down with leaders from the National Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation, the National Congress, health experts around the country, being advised by the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Equality Council, which has been scrapped by this government, a body of experts designed to advise government. This document, a living document, which will provide a framework for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health for 10 years, has been supported by the government, which is a very positive thing. If Twiggy had read it, what he would have seen is it plots a life course about health for every Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australian. It takes from maternal and child health, young people, teenage years, older Australians in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, and he talks about all the social determinants of health. I would say to Twiggy, and I would say to anyone else who's got an interest in his report, read this as well, because this wasn't written in isolation. This was written as a process of extensive consultation, communication, negotiation and agreement with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians.
All right, let me go to, well, first of all, over to Alan. I hear a kind of sub-debate going on here. We've all covered your microphones, well done. But Alan, let me go to you first, and there's obviously a few points there. But what are you hearing from the communities? Is there now a need for a community-up approach rather than a top-down approach from government? And does Twiggy Forrest's plan in any way reflect that?
It does. I think the Forrest report it's a very ambitious one, it's a bold one, but I think it outlines a very good framework. It can't be implemented overnight. It's not a 5-month agenda, it's a 5-year agenda. In relation to the welfare card, which was raised, it's in essence the concept is a debit card. A normal bank debit card which you can use at almost every single retail outlet, but you can't purchase alcohol or cigarettes, or you can't gamble with it. And he proposes that you can't withdraw cash from it. Now, we'll take a look at that. You've already heard from the Prime Minister that we're unlikely to go down the full path that he is recommending.
But of course, you know what he says. You take one cog out of this machine and the whole machine falls apart.
We're going to take this report very seriously. We've already set up an implementation feasibility task force to take a look at that. It does recommend in the report as well that there is much greater local empowerments at the local level, built off the Cape York reforms, which was put forward, I think, by yourself just earlier today, which I had some involvement with some years ago in helping to establish myself, which puts much greater power in the hands of local Indigenous leaders over some of these matters. So that's in the report.
So do you personally think that income management should be managed at a local level by community organisations who make those decisions rather than as, let's say, Bill Shorten would say, 2,000 miles away or closer to home in Darwin or somewhere like that where the bureaucrats are?
There's lots of different models of income management already in place across Australia. So the Northern Territory was the first place where it's been introduced, and it was introduced by the former Labor government, and every single long-term unemployed person now is on income management for 50% of their welfare payments. Now, the evaluations of that show that it actually has been quite effective.
Where's the evaluation?
In terms of there are evaluations already out there, they're published. They show that it's been quite effective in reducing some of the alcohol intake, in helping people to manage their, in terms of helping people to manage their money. In Cape York, it's a different model, as you have pointed out. What Andrew Forrest is recommending is a basics card. The banks issue it, the welfare payments go on it.
Just hang on for a second, Rachel, I'll give you a chance in a minute.
And that card can be used at different retail outlets for the purchase of every single item, except for some prohibited ones.
Rachel.
Whether you've got a basics card or a debit card, you are being discriminated against. I'm sorry, you are not the same as everybody else. You are restricted to what you'll be able to buy is the concept. I'm sorry, it's discriminatory. People will still feel disempowered because they don't have control over their own decision making. Sorry, that's the bottom line for me. In terms of the NT intervention, I'm sorry, Shayne, but it doesn't apply just to a certain group of vulnerable families. As Alan just said, it applies across the board to a whole categories of people. The government is sitting on the latest report on income management from the Northern Territory. It hasn't been released. I've asked several times about when it's going to be released so we can actually see what the latest results are. I think income management is top-down and not bottom-up. The Forest report wants to rebadge it, but it's still the same thing. It is still income management in another name, and I don't think that's going to get.
Do you support the
acceptance.
Cape York model, just out of interest?
I think it's a better model. I think where you've got genuine community decision making, but where you are empowering communities but you've already set these tight rules, it's not genuine community decision making, I don't think. It is more accepted, but I've also had people in Cape York saying they don't like that either. But I will agree that it is a more acceptable model than it being imposed on everybody. I'm told that the Forest report, you shouldn't read it as if they're saying that everybody should be on it. You can read it both ways, that everybody should be on it or not. In terms of the broader Forest report, I think there are some bits in there that we can all agree on. Certainly you agree on the early childhood learning, but there are 38 centres that the previous government built and are operating, and the ones I've been in are fantastic, and the funding is not guaranteed past December. So here you have, the former Coordinator General of Remote Service Delivery, his last report said, do not press the reset button. It's a great big thing on the front of the report. And what's this government done on this is press the reset button. So it's sort of, people that have read a lot of reports around community development and Aboriginal disadvantage will be reading it going, oh, we've said that before, we've said that report, we've said that before.
Can I just correct this point, because it was raised, I think, by Nova as well, in relation to the childcare centres. They were built by the former government, and when they were built, there was money handed over to the states on the understanding that the capital would be provided to the states to build them, but the operational costs would be taken care of by the state and territory governments.
That's not true.
That was the decision
That's
of the
not
former
true.
Labor government. There was no money put in the forward estimates for operational costs, and so we have continued that decision.
So what do you make of the figure? I've seen this published
That's
that $500 million has effectively been cut out of Indigenous affairs and services in the last budget. True or not true?
There was a
That's absolutely true.
4.5% reduction in the funding overall over the next 4 years, but no funded program has been cut. And indeed, many have had an extension by
Completely
6
untrue.
to 12 months. And
untrue.
as programs which have been funded, as their contracts come to an end, they'll be evaluated against. Now, most of these savings is actually coming from an amalgamation of programs. Believe it or not, at the Commonwealth level, there are 150 separate programs across the Indigenous Affairs portfolio. Now, we have amalgamated those into 5 broad programs in one department, being the Prime Minister's department. So, of course, some savings and efficiencies can be made in the process, and that's exactly what's being
Can I
done.
make
Okay,
those
well, no,
points on
hang on a
that?
sec. Shayne Newman's yelling out, so I'd rather hear
Well,
him on the
it's
microphone.
completely untrue. I mean, that the head of the Prime Minister's P&C department in relation to Indigenous affairs has admitted to Senator Penny Wong in Senate estimates it's all program funding cuts. What about the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Legal Service and the ACT in Northern and New South Wales, which lost their funding? The anti-recidivism program. The workers there weren't even given 2 weeks' notice. The funding was entirely cut. We could go on and on and on. All program funding cuts. It's complete nonsense. $165 million in program funding cuts in Indigenous health. And the other thing about that is Children and Family Centre. We put $565 million in that program, and in that program, including that $565 million, was $75 million from the states and territories. The funding commitment expired on the 30th of June this year. Kate Ellis and I have said repeatedly that we would have continued that funding if we had been in government.
You didn't budget
but
for it, Shayne.
well, the 4 years expired, mate, and we would see. We said
wasn't in your forward estimates,
we
Shayne.
have said it clearly we would have continued the funding. This mob
It's a pity
cut
you
the
didn't say that
funding,
before the election.
and those 38 centres around the country are at their own mercy now. And here they are trying to put a big emphasis on truancy, and here we get this gobbledygook rubbish from the Parliamentary Secretary, which is completely untrue.
All right, 30-second right of reply, Alan. Then I want to move on to other subjects.
The fact of the matter is that Shayne, the Labor Party, did not budget for that funding going forward. You made agreements with the states and territories that the money would be for capital and the operations would be covered by the states and territories. That was your decision. We continued it.
And Ken wanted to get in.
Just very quickly, let me say that I've read the Forest report. The framework for reform is a good, constructive one. And I can say this with some authority because I'm 61 years old. I have seen reports from the Nugget Coombs report through many, many parliaments under many governments and prime ministers who make commitments. And what happens with each report, and if I use the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, is there is cherry picking of which recommendation should be thought about. This report gives us a chance to set aside the political bickering, to look at an approach that reforms what's happening in Aboriginal affairs. I get tired of going to organisations, walking out into a community after being told that everything is being met in the way of targets, and yet I see families that live in poverty still. Nothing for some of these families has changed, and this is going from a period of 1972 when Department of Aboriginal Affairs state grants were brought in, and every report that's been delivered by any government sets a framework for thinking and reactive behaviour, but the trouble is it's never implemented. And if you want to see the truth of that, go and walk through some communities, not only in remote and isolated areas, but walk through some of the suburbs in capital cities where Aboriginal families still live at levels of disparity and disadvantage that is inappropriate in a country like today. So if we're going to deal with this report, don't knock the elements of it. Start to have the debates around the merit of what's feasible, what will work, what can make a difference, and let's move forward on that. Doesn't matter whether Twiggy Forrest wrote it or not. It still captures some historical thoughts that were put forward by Indigenous leaders, and it still captures what is still a gap right across every Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community, except for that proportion of our population who have good incomes, good mainstream positions, and stand on their own feet.
Now, there's a question on the floor. Sorry, just hold that question for a minute, because I'm just going to shift focus, because I want, with the time we've got left, and you can bring the question in a minute, but with the time we've got left, there's a fundamental call at Garma from Galarrwuy Yunupingu and his brother, actually, for a kind of reinvention of land rights, a re-looking at the way in which land rights are done, and in a way an economic empowerment of individual communities. I'm just wondering, and I'll start with Nova on this.
No, I think Warren wants to lead that way.
Warren wants to lead on this way. Okay, we'll start there. I think we should have a bit of a discussion about this with the time we have, because it's been a fundamental shift, or a call for a fundamental shift in the way land rights are handled. Start with you, Warren.
I'm not sure that it's such a fundamental shift. From what I take, and we need to explore this more and have discussions with a whole range of other people.
Well, if they take away from the Northern Land Council
hang on,
significant powers, that is a fundamental shift.
Well, no. I mean, the current Land Rights Act allows for regional structures to administer aspects of the Land Rights Act. That isn't an issue. I think the question here is that it's got to be done in a way which actually meets the needs of all of the people who are engaged in the region, not just some people. And it needs to be recognised that, and Senator Scullion, to his credit, said this yesterday, he would not support any amendments to the Land Rights Act which were not supported by the Land Council. He made this very clear.
But he's already put regulatory changes up, which Labor is
which we think have got real problems with them. Yeah. And we're not getting Aboriginal people coming to us and say we want these responsibilities given to these, effectively changing the whole way in which land rights decisions are made by corporations is really not what we're about. But what we are about is actually listening to people, and we'll go through this discussion as we properly should, but we will not be prejudging the outcome until we've had those discussions.
Ken, can I bring you in on this?
Exactly.
You presumably have heard the calls
Absolutely
here.
Right.
What do you make of this idea, that the effective power to run your own community and what happens on the land be shifted to the communities themselves?
Look, I heard the comments yesterday, and it's my personal belief that if we're going to change Aboriginal communities, they have to become equal partners. They also have to become empowered to make decisions for themselves. Because in a community, the people who know what is needed are those who live there on a daily basis. Let me say, governments negotiate with local governments on an equal footing. We don't do that with Aboriginal communities on land right issues. I heard what Galarrwuy talked about yesterday, and we need to move forward. Because if there is a community, it doesn't matter where it is in this country, that wants to reposition the land rights debate that enables them to develop an economic base without an overarching organisation oversighting everything they do, then I personally don't have a problem with it, and I'd certainly advocate that should be a matter that both parties within the major parliament, along with the Greens and the Independents, should give serious consideration to. If a community is asking for economic independence, they have the capability and capacity of doing it, why should we stand in their way?
Let's go to a question from the floor. Is it on this subject, I think, possibly? Go ahead.
Yep, Sean Gordon, CEO of Dark and Jungle Land Council in New South Wales, probably the greatest land rights system in the country. It gives Aboriginal people ownership of freehold land to make decisions to do whatever it is they want with that land, which is something that these communities don't have an opportunity to have. I guess the challenge I have today is that we're listening to politicians talking about consecutive governments and politicians that have created this problem within Aboriginal communities. Governments have created the dependency that exists within Aboriginal communities. Governments have to be able to relinquish and shift control, and just listening to the panel today, no one is talking about shifting the responsibility. I've heard Ken talk about shifting the responsibility and giving control back to communities. Communities know the decisions that they want to make. Communities know what's in the best interest for them and how to move forward. But governments are willing to relinquish that control and to give communities those responsibilities. If a community decides that they want to develop a parcel of land, and that might affect some green group that's living in Sydney, then those Greens groups need to butt out and stay in Sydney and allow those communities to make those decisions. That is the reality. Our people have been crippled. We all saw what the GFC did to countries. It crippled these countries. Aboriginal people in this country have been crippled from day one of European settlement. We have not had an economic base. We have not been able to make decisions that empower and affect our people to create real change within our communities. Governments have a role to govern, not control. You have to shift control back to Aboriginal people and allow us to make the decisions. We may make wrong decisions, but we will learn from them and we will make adjustments to get to the right decision. Right now, we're not hearing enough of it coming out of the politicians' mouths and coming out of government's mouths to say that we will give you control to make decisions that is in the best interest of your people within your community. Make the mistakes, learn from them, but ensure that you move forward.
Thank you.
I agree with you, brother. Not bloody control. Okay? You're elected to govern the country, not control.
I'm glad you don't have a banner and a chant, because that works for you. All right, okay, save it for later.
Yeah.
Nova.
Okay, I agree, Auntie Andrea over there, and I agree exactly what you're saying, and I as an Aboriginal woman, I'm a traditional landowner, and I have family who have also had a sense of frustrations about being able to do things with their land. It's like they own the land, but what can you do? Because there are so many obstacles that they have to overcome. At the same time, I believe that the Land Council are very, very, very important in determining claims and all that sort of stuff. I think what Nigel tried to do in December with regards to putting forward like a watered down version of how, I guess, what was the word? What was he exactly trying to do?
He was trying to smash the land council.
He was trying to smash the land council.
Completely destroy them.
But also, it's a very complex system, and they've been around for a long time. I think what we need to do is we've got Joe Morrison, who has come on board as the new CEO of the Northern Land Council. He is fully aware of the level of frustration, and I know here, the Yolngu people, that, you know, in some cases they've had applications in land councils that have been there for 6 and 7 years, and they've got money to actually build schools and build houses, and that is ridiculous. Where would you see in society if an Aboriginal person wants to build a school, build houses, do all these sorts of things on their land, and they're held back? They've got funding to do it. And what white fella would sit there for 6 years scratching their head and saying, we just want to move forward? So I agree with you, brother, everything that you say, and I see the frustration. But right now there are people, new fresh people that are coming through the system that understands the changes, and we have the solutions to our own problems, and we've just got to be working respectively and allowing the land councils, because I don't think we can do without them. They are sometimes they're seen too much of a gatekeeper, but they are safekeepers of what is. If we don't have land, then we have nothing. That's a whole spiritual connection.
What about this fundamental shift? And Marcia talked about it in her speech, and she wrote about it in The Australian the other day, to ownership, and particularly individual ownership of houses, and ownership of land, so that, in fact, freehold is what we've been hearing about in New South Wales. That shift may have already happened in some states. What about here?
I think we need to go to the history of land rights in the Northern Territory and understand that when the Land Rights Act was developed as a result of the case here with Blackburn, the Woodward Commission, the then first draft of the Land Rights Act, which was subsequently passed by Fred when he was, I think Ian Viner was the minister in the Fraser government. It was all about inalienable freehold title. And whenever I've spoken to an Aboriginal person who's involved in administering land in the Northern Territory, no one has said they want to get rid of that underlying title that is inalienable. That does not prevent people from leasing their land for commercial purposes, and people have done it. and they will continue to do it. And there are any number of Aboriginal organisations and communities in the Northern Territory who, under the Land Rights Act, get Section 19 leases for any length of period. We've got township
Warren,
leases.
because we're running out of time, so I've just got to quickly ask you this. If it's possible, and clearly in New South Wales it's happening, if it's possible, why isn't it happening, and why isn't it happening more quickly?
It is happening here, but I cannot foresee a time when you'd get an agreement across the Northern Territory from Aboriginal people to get rid of an inalienable freehold title. I cannot see that happening. It's not to say that people will not say, we want people to work on our land, we want to use the land for productive economic purposes, we want to create businesses, we want to build houses, we want to do all of these things, which they are doing. The question becomes how they do it, how we expedite it, how we make sure we meet their concerns and desires. And if they desire to get rid of an inalienable freehold title, so be it.
We're going to go back to...
But Warren, you're also talking about legislation...
Can you stand up so other people can see you? Sorry.
You're also talking about legislation that ensures government have absolute control of resources and minerals that don't allow Aboriginal people to have ownership in regards to it.
Well, the minerals...
And that's a significant component of...
No, the minerals belong to the Crown. We can't control that. That's the problem. I mean, if the minerals didn't belong to the Crown, it wouldn't be an issue, but they do.
Okay, I'm just going to go to Alan Tudge on this, because we're nearly... actually, I'll rely on the organisers to tell me if we've got a little extra time. A couple of minutes?
I'll just be...
2 minutes? Okay.
Just very briefly... Just very briefly then, Tony, I think that if local traditional owners want to have 99-year leases on their land so that they can have economic development, so they can have home ownership like most other people in Australia do, then they should be given that opportunity. I think it is as simple as that.
They can do it. They can do it now.
We can do it.
Just very quickly on that one though, that what both governments were doing is requiring communities to do that before they got resources for houses and things like that. So I agree with what Warren said. If communities collectively decide that's what they want to go down, one size doesn't fit all. But the point is that communities were forced to do that because that's how government saw economic development.
And Ken, final word if you wouldn't mind.
Let's take the opportunity from out of today, out of the discussions that have happened. Let's look to an optimistic future in which we support the capacity of communities to make their decisions, to be equal partners, and in 10 years' time see the improvements that we need across a range of indicators, not just the 5 goals of closing the gap.
Okay, thank you very much. Please thank our panel.